Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. Christian, good to meet you.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Yeah. I had just gotten back about a week ago from an interview we're doing for my series, The Cover-Up, with Dr. Richard Ebright. And of course, I follow him, and we're conversing on X as well. And he's basically tweeting every sentence of the article you wrote, which is good PR if you can get it.
I'll take it, yeah.
But that's how I found this article that you wrote. What's the title of it?
Sure. Did Fauci cause the pandemic? Or I think the magazine title is Fauci's Pandemic.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. But you guys softened the title?
For the online rollout, I guess,
Yeah.
whatever works with SEO. But
Well, what's funny about that, and Matt Ridley would say the same thing, because he just recently published an article where the editors made a more declarative statement. Fauci did this. I forget what the title was. But of course, we'll never know 1,000%.
So, I mean, I think, and that's what the online title at least alludes to,
Yeah.
is we don't know 100%. There's no definitive, here's the email showing this is what happened. We don't have Richard Nixon on the tape saying, do the cover up. But again, my article was about looking at just all the information that's come out, all the overwhelming preponderance of circumstantial evidence leading up to what was happening at the Wuhan lab, and then what happened after the virus was a real thing, suggesting that Fauci was...
See, I don't have this hesitation, because I think, they obviously probably destroyed any definitive evidence at the
Certainly.
Wuhan lab that would document this. But I go all the way back to 2021, and throughout 2020, I was focused on the economic consequences, the humanitarian catastrophe of locking down the economy. And that was my reaction from day one. But as you got into it, you had to become an amateur epidemiologist, and you had to start to question the science. And I was talking to Matt Ridley on my show, and my point is, the moment we saw this over-the-top effort by Fauci and Collins and other people to cover up the potential critics who are suggesting, maybe this came from a lab. When I saw that insane response, I'm like, okay, it came from a lab. I know now, because sometimes the cover-up, I won't say the cover-up's worse than the crime, but in my case, I was at that moment convinced, and sort of went down this rabbit hole of, well, why are they doing gain-of-function research? And over time, you could obviously, like, if they did in fact create the virus that killed millions of people, obviously they cover it up, because they go down in history as monsters.
Sure, yeah, so that's not a good reputation you want to have. And it's so conspicuous as well, given how mainstream these debates about gain-of-function research and the potential for lab accidents was prior to the pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, this was an interest of the Obama administration, was, this research has potentially some benefits and also a lot of, tail end very serious consequences or costs if we have a lab accident. So they had multiple different types of regulatory frameworks to try and get it under control, to vet this stuff more closely. There was a lot of argument about whether it was doing a good job or not. And then the pandemic hits, and then all of a sudden this discussion of whether a lab leak occurred is fringe conspiratorial banter for, at least a couple of years until now. It seems like finally we can have a more adult conversation about these kinds of things.
Yeah, it's Fauci has it's in a sort of ironic, given his response to Rand Paul when he asked him about gain-of-function research, but Fauci is well documented, and I think you pulled a New York Times article where Fauci is saying that the research that he financed, if I get the story right, he financed the excavation of the remnants of Spanish flu, which had not existed on Earth, and they found some corpse in Alaska.
Right.
And
real beginning of a disaster movie.
Yeah.
Inuit woman.
I feel like I've seen that movie. Yeah.
So going back to 2005, as you mentioned, they excavated a corpse in the Arctic, which had preserved Spanish lung flu in her lungs. And then I think they also had samples from World War I soldiers as well, and a scientist using NIAID funding, NIAID being the agency that Fauci had headed for decades, used those samples to recreate Spanish flu. This was incredibly controversial at the time in 2005, and one of the chief proponents of it was Fauci, saying that there's risks, but ultimately we think the benefits in terms of finding out how Spanish flu might arise again, or developing a vaccine for it, is worth those risks. This was his response every time they had some sort of dust up over gain of function research. So you fast forward a few years from 2005, there was this researchers both in Wisconsin and then in the Netherlands, they did a gain of function on H1N1, which is, or H5N1, I'm missing the exact, but bird flu is what it was. It's H5N1, yes. And he made it, the researcher in the Netherlands and then also in Wisconsin, made it transmissible between ferrets in the lab. So a gain of function, it used to not be able to spread between mammals. Hugely controversial again. The scientists in the Netherlands who produced this gain of function said I probably created the most deadly virus in the in the world. And Fauci again is out there saying, hey, look, there's risks to this, there's theoretical risks, but the benefits definitely outweigh those, so we should keep plugging along with this kind of research.
It's fascinating. That's his go-to argument, although he doesn't say it anymore now that something is actually leaked out. But he had this go-to argument that there's some theoretical risk, but the benefits outweigh that. But right. There is, as far as I know, no attempt to actually measure risks and benefits that you could objectively say. I mean, any analysis like that is going to have some fudging going on, but I don't think he's ever run the numbers.
No, and actually he's fought very hard to ensure that those numbers aren't run. So after that H5N1 research, very controversial, came out, eventually that led to the Obama administration putting a pause on gain-of-function research, specifically pausing gain-of-function research that would allow certain types of pandemic viruses to be more transmissible via the respiratory route in mammals. Fauci fought against this. He was opposed to this pause, saying that, again, it undermines the benefits. And then the Obama administration, a few years later, came out with, they weakened the pause, but they created this new framework called the P3CO framework, saying that if you are going to do this kind of research, if someone proposes a grant, the people reviewing the grant need to send it up to the top of HHS, so it's above Fauci, to do some sort of cost-benefit analysis, some sort of review to see if this is actually worth pursuing, this is actually worth funding, this is actually worth putting taxpayer dollars behind. And Fauci was against this framework, and then throughout, and he worked very much to undermine it, basically by NIH never sending up any sorts of experiments for review. So this is a small set of research that's actually being done. But when they came out with this framework, the expectation was, well, maybe there would be, a few dozen experiments that we would vet, that HHS would vet, and instead they only got around to 3. And that's because NIH and NIAID under Fauci, they were responsible for deciding what research went up the chain for review, and basically none of it did. So,
yeah, there was tremendous discretion in the so-called pause, always. But would you interpret not following the process as a legal violation, or was it looser than that, where they determined whether or not they should send it up the chain of command?
So. I'm not sure if it would count as any sort of illegal violation, given that both of these things were regulatory policies put down by the White House. So I don't know exactly what legal standing they would have. When I talk to folks who are maybe less Fauci critical, but were responsible for coming up with these frameworks, they generally, either they'll decline to say, on a specific example, whether this was violating the process or not. But what they point to, and this is in my article, I interviewed Gerald Epstein, who actually wrote the P3CO framework. He said the fact that you're sending so few up to begin with tells me that NIAID is interpreting this language in the framework so narrowly as to basically exclude plenty of experiments that should be getting reviewed. And then in the case of, which I don't know if you want to get into right now, but the EcoHealth grant that was doing this kind of gain-of-function research in Wuhan, it seems that's actually a much more direct case if they were just not following the policy. And whether that was an explicit instruction from Fauci or not, that's one of those unknowns, but certainly at the lower levels of NIH, they were not following the policy pretty explicitly. So
yeah, like the more you dig into it, you realize that Fauci has this maniacal obsession with creating monster viruses, and And when I talked to Dr. Ebright, he takes it all the way back, even preceding the anthrax leak, which, by the way, came out of a government-funded lab and a
Right.
government-financed. I don't know if it was a government employee, but it was essentially a government employee that ended up being found guilty of the anthrax leaks. To Richard Ebright's point, that the likelihood of this coming from the governments doing the research is far more obvious than an actual terrorist threat, or a private sector threat. But like this goes all the way back to Dick Cheney's obsession with bioterrorism and wanting a grand, sweeping, comprehensive government response to that. And 9/11 happens, anthrax scare happens, and Cheney sees an opportunity to push this through. And this is where Fauci became the kingpin of not just bioterrorism research, ostensibly to stop bioterrorism, always the intention. But he basically created a cartel that controlled all of government science funding. And so there's perversions beyond gain of function that happen because of it.
Sure. Yeah, the inflection point with 9/11 is really interesting. So, leading up to that point, there had already started to be concerns about what was called dual-use research of concern at the time. So, research that could be used for perfectly normal civilian purposes, but then could also be used by terrorists or, just pose a risk of a lab accident. And then after 9/11, I think you charted out very well, is you kind of had two potential responses. So one was we have these biosecurity threats, anthrax, someone could make chemical weapons. One response is, okay, we should be much more careful about funding this type of research, having labs proliferate to get this kind of money to do this research and create these deadly weapons in a lab, as part of an effort to prevent, stop their use or have therapeutics should they eventually be used. That was one approach. And then the other approach was to actually, to double down on doing this kind of research, to have more of these labs, more funding, which then, of course, the criticism is that this just opens up more opportunities for you to have a lab incident, whether that's an accident, whether that's some sort of security breach. And so by trying, funding efforts to prevent this risk, you end up increasing the risk that it happens, which I think, again, bleeds right into what ended up happening with COVID.
I have exciting news. Our latest documentary, The Free Life, Portrait of an Artist, a project that we've been working on for several years here at Free the People, is finally available to view. This is a story of my friend Carlos Luna, an artist who had to flee communist Cuba in order to create the beautiful things that he does now in Miami, Florida. His grandmother actually told him, "You must leave if you want to create your art." It's a beautiful story. It's a hero's journey. And you have an opportunity now to see it for the very first time. Go to watch.freethepeople.org. It's $9.99. This is the first time you'll be able to see it. We've been showing it at film festivals. We've been winning awards. Now you have your chance. I'm eager to hear what you think about it. So check it out. Watch.freethepeople.org. Maybe it was the Spanish flu, but I think it was the H1N1, the weaponized bird flu, where the scientists that did the research wanted to publish the results. And another great outcry, it was the bird flu, I believe, another great outcry, but Fauci insisted that they publish it. So I'm scratching my head and saying, what is the national security interest in creating a monster virus and then publishing the handbook on how you could do it at home?
Right. I mean, it's not a cost benefit analysis that makes much sense to me. I mean, I think you can always, there's always difficult questions about, a private researcher comes up with results. Obviously, you don't want to put restrictions on people pursuing their own scientific research, publishing information, what have you. But it is certainly bizarre when this is coming from government officials whose job is to minimize the risk of, dangerous flus being created, lab accidents, the like. And then, put a lot of significant government dollars behind this. And then also fight against any sort of restrictions, so that the taxpayers are seeing their money spent wisely, but also that just to protect the general public from what the government is funding. Fauci has always been on the side of, I quoted one of my articles saying this, more science, less regulation. But to be clear, that's less regulation of what government scientists or scientists with government funding are doing. So in that way, I guess it makes sense as you interpret it as a bureaucrat who basically wants no limitations on his own particular role within the bureaucracy, in this case funding very risky research.
Yeah, I mean, you quote Matt Ridley in the article, and I've had a conversation with him about this, that the outcry that pushed for the eventual pause by the Obama administration and the pushback on resuscitating the Spanish flu and weaponizing the bird flu was coming from the scientific community. And back then it was, I would argue, far more decentralized than it is today. And I believe today it's primarily captured by the federal government and this ecosystem of agencies that have all been, and universities been feeding off of this dangerous research. But back then it was the community self-regulating, saying we should not be doing this. And the government proceeded, with all of this power and money, proceeded to do it anyway. And Ebright argues that it's not plausible that the private sector would be climbing around in bat caves,
right,
trying to find deadly viruses and then manipulating them in a lab. There is no commercial application. There is no actual, he would say something stronger. There's no proven health benefits to doing this kind of dangerous gain-of-function research. So as a libertarian, I'm always thinking about, what would happen if the government hadn't done any of this? Would we be safer? Would we be at risk in fear that some, Dr. Evil type guy does it instead? And I think it's pretty obvious that the government itself is creating potential weapons that can be stolen, can be hijacked, or more likely can be, released burn after reading style, just dumb, stupid bureaucrats working in half-assed labs in China because they're not allowed to do it in North Carolina anymore.
Sure, right. And I mean, that's something that I think has been kind of suppressed in the early discussion of Lab Leak, was just how often you had lab accidents and lab incidents. So, when I mentioned the H5N1, the bird flu research, the lab in Wisconsin that was doing this research, was being done in the Netherlands as well, they had a lab incident shortly after they were doing this research and telling everyone, no, it's perfectly safe, we've never had any incidents, whatever, and it took years for that to come out. And then you also have some of these researchers, again, EcoHealth, Peter Daszak, saying in their grant proposals, or at least in the notes on their grant proposals, not necessarily what they told the government when they were submitting them, that we're going to do this research in China because they have lower biosafety protocols, and so therefore it's cheaper for us to do it there. To talk about your earlier point about whether there's any sort of commercial application for this stuff. Yeah, the argument for this particular type of gain-of-function research is that if you go out to, disease hotspots, areas where humans are butting up against wildlife, you can find viruses that are likely to spill over into humans, and then you can, evolve them in the lab naturally or do experiments and make hybrid viruses to figure out what the virus that will leap from an animal to a human is going to look like. Then we can, develop vaccines and be ready to go when a pandemic happens. This already was this is heavily criticized by the scientific community when Peter Daszak was going around giving government funding to do this, because it's just like the odds that there's thousands, millions of viruses in nature, the odds that you'd find the one and then exactly predict the evolutionary chain it would take that would then cause it to infect humans is just so minimal. And then we know it was useless because where this research was most concentrated, in Wuhan, that's where the pandemic started. And so even if you discount all the evidence for a potential lab accident, if it's a natural origin, it happens right in the backyard of the place where they're doing this research to prepare vaccines to stop this very thing from happening, and they fail to see it coming, they fail to prevent it. I think that calls the whole enterprise into question, and certainly doesn't seem like something even the most starry-eyed VC investor would put money behind this. So
yeah, the university lab in Wisconsin, was it the University of Wisconsin?
I believe so. Yeah.
They actually had multiple incidents, and the first, it's sort of again more invoking the Coen Brothers movie Burn After Reading than any sort of grand conspiracy because
Right.
they're just being idiots. So supposedly all of these protocols are in place, particularly if you're making something that deadly, like devastating humanity if they
Mm-hmm.
leak it out. Discover that they don't have the protocols in place at all. Command Central at NIH freaks out and takes them to the woodshed and said, "Get it right."
Right.
And then they didn't do anything,
Yeah.
and then they had another near miss.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not even like as someone that would be generally skeptical of government efficiently and safely doing anything, they clearly don't have the ability to regulate themselves when it comes to safety when you're doing these things that, as Rand Paul points out, like if you're talking about 1%, 5%, 10% of the population, this is devastation beyond our imaginations, beyond what Hollywood could concoct, and we just keep stumbling along, keep doing it.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, part of that is obviously a resistance within NIH and these agencies to have greater restrictions on the labs that they fund, the researchers themselves. And yeah, part of this is just, these various, almost pro forma updates to lab safety or doing some sort of cost benefit analysis come down, and then the agencies just purposefully defang them. And it just, you have labs, you're going to have accidents too. And so that, I think that just raises the question of, well, you have to put that heavily on the side of the ledger of potential cost then, because, someone's going to drop a vial, someone's going to prick their finger or whatever. So,
Yeah, it it was sort of a red pill moment for me because I would have been one of those libertarians that had sort of a naive belief in the scientific process and medical innovation and the idea that scientific research is going to allow us to live longer and healthier and happier lives. Even I, as cynical as I am, didn't realize how much the scientific community is essentially owned sometimes, but certainly controlled by this kingdom that Fauci created. Because the imprimatur of NIH funding determines whether or not your career moves forward or not. And
mm-hmm.
you're talking about millions and millions of dollars going to these university research institutions. They basically controlled the process. So when they asked certain scientists to help them cover it up, the only answer is yes.
Right, I believe one of the authors on the proximal origins paper, which was produced, early into the pandemic, saying this was definitely not a lab leak. This was almost certainly a virus of natural origin. At least one of the authors had a pending application for an $8 million grant. And again, these things are, discretionary. It's not like they're legally entitled to that money if they meet certain qualifications. And so, under any other arrangement, just take away the political context of all this for a second. Under any other arrangement, that would obviously be a huge incentive to if you're dealing with, there's some sort of ambiguity to bend your analysis to one way or another. And in fact, with the proximal origins paper, as we know from FOIA requests and congressional investigations, a lot of these authors did lean towards a lab leak being most likely, and then changed their minds very readily, while they were in conversation with NIH, this agency that was holding millions of dollars of grants over their head. I believe national.
And then those grants were approved.
Yes,
by the way.
right,
Yes.
of course, yeah,
Yes.
right. I believe National Institute of Health is something like a $50 billion organization, and Fauci's agency NIAID is $8 to $6 billion. And if you, that's just a huge amount of money going into scientific research. And so, even though a lot of these folks are working for universities, nonprofits, nominally private organizations, just the amount of government funding just really means that the government is setting the priorities for who gets this money, what kind of research is done, under what conditions it's done.
It kind of I'm trying to think of a metaphor to get people to understand what's really going on. And I think the Manhattan Project is the closest thing I can think of, that this entire research paradigm is not really about public health at all. Sometimes Fauci says that, but it was done under the auspices of the U.S. response to a bioterrorist event. And so they're creating all of these, they're harvesting all of these viruses, and then they're manipulating these viruses. And I think you already mentioned the absurdity of imagining that you could map out everything and then come up with a cure,
Mm-hmm.
vaccine for all of that. It just sounds absurd on its face. But then you have an apparatchik like Fauci when they're shopping around, like, how do we do this? We can't do it at DOD anymore
Right.
because we've been caught doing that. And Fauci's like, hold my beer, I'll do it. I can do that. Um, it's it seems like a sci-fi movie.
Yeah, or just like that kind of classic scientific hubris, I think, is what it is. It's like, well, we're smart, and so eventually, with enough money and enough time and effort, we'll be able to make this kind of research work. And it really is almost just like central planning on a virological level, right? We're going to collect all the information, synthesize it, experiment with it, and then come up with solutions to whatever sort of virus might be out there, as opposed to I think what a market would produce is something that's a bit more reactive to emerging threats. We have a virus that has emerged and starting to infect humans, so that's where our research should go. That's where our efforts should go. I think that would, if you ran the numbers, that would look better on a cost benefit analysis and probably more in accordance with what free markets or some sort of emergent order in scientific research would look like.
Regular viewers of Kibbe on Liberty already know how obsessed I have been with the pandemic industrial complex and all of the stupid, authoritarian, and downright evil things that the government did to us during COVID-19. Well, I'm proud to announce a new investigative series that looks to get to the bottom of all of that. It's called The Cover-Up, and I'm producing it in cooperation with BlazeTV. The only place you're going to see this is BlazeTV, so go to FauciCoverup.com/Kibbe and use the code FauciLied for $30 off your annual subscription. Do it now. The truth is out there. Yes, I quote this article all the time. Maybe you've read it. Fauci co-authored with the guy that he barely knows, David Morans.
Oh, right. Yeah, sure.
He had to disown him in an academic journal called Cell. And the last few paragraphs are chilling to your point about central planning, because Frederick Hayek is spinning in his grave right now because they're writing about this grand plan to reimagine humanity. And they actually use the phrase bend modernity. And they want to do stuff about air travel, and they want to do stuff about human interaction, and they want to centrally plan every tiny little aspect of our lives because they're the science, and they know. This isn't just about the corruption of public health. It's a fundamental corruption of what the role of government in any plausible way should be.
Sure, and I think you see that corruption in the kind of incongruency between Fauci's own approach and the government's own approach generally to no restrictions on, very little oversight on this kind of very dangerous research. We don't want to put any restrictions on our own scientists, but then once a pandemic emerges, well, then we should have all sorts of restrictions on what private people can be able to do, whether your business can be open, whether it can be 20% occupancy, 40% occupancy, when and where you have to wear a mask, just like the endless mandates and restrictions and guidance that we got from public health during the pandemic. It doesn't really make sense, and like most obviously doesn't make sense. That's like, okay, we're the small risk but very real risk that someone creates a world-ending virus, we're not going to have any restrictions on that. But the slightly more likely risk that someone will pass on one virus to another, that we need to put as much regulations on private activity as possible. That doesn't, really compute, I think, just looking at it like that, but it makes more sense when you realize that these guys are just central planners, right? It's like, so long as they are the ones deciding these things, fewer restrictions for me, more restrictions for everyone else, because we're obviously the smart people who can kind of guide society, through a public health emergency like this.
Yeah. I mean, in retrospect, we now know that there was an entire literature in public health about the potential collateral damage caused by lockdowns, and almost universally rejected as a strategy because of some obvious costs associated with whatever the potential benefits would be. Later on, Fauci said, yeah, the 6-foot thing, it just sort of showed up.
Right.
Don't know where that came from.
Mm-hmm.
There's plenty of evidence, at least that I've read, that masks were never a plausible solution to this. So the question is, why did they do it anyway? And, you know, the benign theory that Jay Bhattacharya has proposed to me is that they knew that this was a killer, and they knew that it probably leaked out of a lab, and they were going to throw everything in the kitchen sink at this thing in hopes to minimize the damage. That doesn't quite make sense to me, because the obvious collateral damage was there. Any wild theories, unproven by facts or science, as to why they did this military-like response to COVID?
Yeah, I mean, part of it was you did have I think it was just this case of you had an emergency and you had some plans lying around saying this is what you do in response to a flu outbreak, right? The George W. Bush administration was, they were very hawkish on a lot of things, but they were hawkish on potential for flu outbreaks as well in response to bird flu and other things like that. And so they had all these various plans for lockdowns or social distancing just kind of sitting on the shelf. And so then COVID happens, and so we're like, well, here's what's written down. I guess we'll try this playbook. The problem, of course, is that COVID was so much more transmissible. And I mean, you can debate whether that would have been worth it for the flu, of course, right? Mm-hmm. But the problem is COVID was so much more transmissible than the flu that all these like efforts at social distancing just or masking didn't really work, because there was still going to be enough circulation amongst people in the public that you would never actually really, crush the virus, or, 2 weeks to slow the spread, prevent it from circulating, and therefore it would die out on its own. That was never a real possibility. And I think that actually speaks to, this is another point of evidence that people say for why COVID probably did come from a lab, is because it was so highly transmissible, from the jump. Normally, something like a bird flu or what have you, like you look at the number of people infected from those outbreaks, and it's in the hundreds. The lethality is much higher, but its ability to spread for humans is so much lower because it had just jumped to humans, right? Yeah. It hadn't had that opportunity to evolve, whereas COVID seemed basically ready to go to infect humans immediately. And so, why was that? Potentially because it was made to do that. So.
It's interesting. I had forgotten that it was the Bush administration, George W. Bush, that had sort of imagined these more, I would call it a militaristic approach. I'm a fan of zombie movies, and I know how the government mitigates a zombie apocalypse. They do it exactly like we did during COVID. They lock down, they quarantine by any means necessary, and I want to make sure people keep going back to the response to 9/11 and the anthrax scare, and the fact that we had a militarized response instead of what the public health community had talked about for all those years. There's a researcher, I don't know if you've read any of her stuff, Debbie Lehrman, who has written for Brownstone, quite tremendous body of work that she's done, who argues that and I think she documents this well, that the response to COVID at the highest reaches of even the Trump administration was really controlled by the intelligence and defense apparatus, and not public health. They all reported to that. And in hindsight, it makes it make a little bit of sense to me, like it's because it looks like every zombie movie I've seen.
Yeah, and I mean, I wonder, obviously it's interesting, kind of going back and reading about just kind of the early history of the response to COVID. It's just like there were just a huge number of chefs in the kitchen. I think the COVID task force represented like 20 different agencies. You try to do the org chart of who's responsible for responding to a pandemic, and basically every government department has some sort of input to it. And so I think that's why they did default to just like, we have these things on the shelf. And then also, again, there's this central planning mentality, right? Like if you think about lockdowns or social distancing, masking, whatever, there's a certain kind of like brute logic to it, which is like, well, the closer you are to someone, the more you're breathing around them, the more likely it is they're going to get infected, and that will, spread more easily. So of course, let's just order society to spread out more. But obviously people aren't going to respond to those dictates as much as you would hope. There's a lot you don't know about the virus and how it spreads. And I think once they kind of established this approach, it's, well, we have to stick with this because we're the ones who get to decide, right? And if we come back and say, oh no, this doesn't actually work, this doesn't really make any sense, then you don't really have any other options. Once you say, okay, capacity restrictions didn't really make any sense, but we still need a solution to the pandemic, you have nothing, right? So
yeah, it seemed like at some point a bureaucratic spiral. You couldn't actually, after having done that to people, you couldn't actually come out and say, you know what, that didn't work at all.
Right.
I know that you weren't allowed to go to your grandmother's funeral, and I know you couldn't visit your mom in the hospital. None of that made any difference at all. Sorry, let's move forward.
Right.
It's probably not what a politician is going to do.
No, and in fact, what they did instead then was like, we have to get off this, have to get off this train somehow, but we'll do it to make it look like these things are sensible. Will come off gradually, right? Oh, okay, you weren't allowed to dine inside. Now you can do that if it's 75% capacity,
Right.
or if you wear your mask from the door to the table. All these kinds of marginal changes that if you follow the logic of a lockdown, didn't even make any sense, right? But just I get either as a face-saving measure, or they had just bought into this idea and thought that a marginal change, they still had this ability to manipulate the virus like that. So
Super sciencey.
sure, yeah, very sciencey.
Yeah. The
It
best.
has numbers attached to it,
Yeah.
so it's got to be true, right?
So I just this week I had Bryce Nichols on my show, and he's another what is he? He's a virologist, I think. Do you remember Logan? Bryce Nichols? I don't know, but anyway, a colleague of Dr. Richard Ebright and the co-founder of an organization called Biosafety Now that are pushing for much stronger regulations on this type of gain-of-function research. And he was teasing me because he knows I'm a libertarian, and he's like, well, this is a government program. How can you support that? And I said, well, I support regulations on nuclear weapons, but I would point out to you that it's the government that made those weapons that could lead to the mass destruction of humanity, and I feel the same way about gain-of-function research. I would rather not regulate it. I would rather get rid of it, and I think that would be the most reasonable thing to do. But there's a number of proposals advocated by Ebright and Nichols, Senator Rand Paul, and you mentioned a lot of this. Talk about what that is and what the prospects are for actually stopping some of the madness.
Sure, absolutely. Well, first, Asaj, maybe your libertarian concerns about all this. If you read Capitalism and Freedom, Milton Friedman, when he's talking about whether we should license doctors or not, the one reason he can come up with for why we maybe want to license doctors is one of them might do a dangerous experiment in the lab and lose a virus on the rest of the world. And that was in the 1960s. So,
well, we always thought Milton was a bit of a squish.
a bit of a squish, right? But no. So, what are the various proposals? So, the P3CO framework that I mentioned earlier, that's been everyone kind of agreed this didn't work, and it's since been superseded by a new set of Biden administration regulations, basically trying to make it more obvious and more automatic when a grant proposal to do research dealing with certain types of pathogens needs to be forwarded to HHS for additional review. That's come under a lot of criticism from folks like Richard Ebright for being just wholly insufficient, and I think that's I think there's a lot of merit to their criticisms. If you look at what happened, the failure points that led up to this dangerous research being funded in Wuhan, it all came from people within NIH deciding just of their own initiative not to send things up the chain, right? So giving them more clear instructions that this type of research does need to be forwarded up the chain. Well, they're still the ones deciding this thing. What Senator Rand Paul has proposed in some recently introduced legislation is to have this research all be vetted by an independent board outside of NIH. I think that gets a lot closer to the problem, is the people who are funding this research are separate from the people deciding whether it's safe enough to proceed with doing in the first place. That's just kind of like classic organization, is you get rid of these conflicts of interest by having the safety regulators be separate from the funding organization. I think that's a lot more sensible of approach. We'll see where it goes. So.
At Kibbe on Liberty, freedom is a lifestyle 24/7, something you live and breathe and wear every day. If that describes you, you need the very best Liberty swag in the market today, just like this shirt I happen to be wearing. Go to freethepeople.org/KOL and check out our exciting merch. You too can love liberty and look cool.
I always just worry about sort of bureaucrats who are always going to find a workaround. Not that that's ever happened before, but it might happen in the future. But also just like regulatory capture. So much of what I've seen the dissident voices were stifled in this process, and everybody's sort of feeding in the same ecosystem. So I wonder if you can ever find a truly independent oversight function.
Sure.
But it sounds better than what we're doing now.
Sure. Yeah, and Richard Ebright, he said, the personnel change at NIH and NIAID is huge in of itself. The fact that you don't have Fauci in there anymore, you don't have Francis Collins, who were, the real proponents of this kind of research, and so maybe that's just an initial step, given that they're, you're right, it's such a small group of researchers, right? But if there's less enthusiasm, absent any other regulatory changes from the people in charge of these agencies to fund them in the first place, I guess that goes some way towards solving the problem. But yeah, more broadly, I think if you wanted to zoom out, just have less government funding of this stuff in the first place, or no government funding of scientific research, right? If you want to go all the way, and then that would eliminate a huge source of money for, basically the only source of money for these kinds of experiments. And so maybe that would be the ultimate solution. That would be the libertarian solution. I don't know how politically practical it is.
Well, the libertarian solution would be the complete separation of science and state. This makes some of my epidemiologist friends anxious because they believe, and I don't think it's true, but they believe that certain types of basic research are not going to happen without the government's involvement. I don't believe that's true, but if we can get closer to that, I'd love to have that debate with them. But right now, any limits on this kind of stuff, and it's hard to overemphasize. I know, Megyn Kelly just said this the other day. She was on her wildly successful podcast saying that as much as she would like to talk about the lockdown and the potential of vaccine damage and all the collateral damage caused by the government's response to COVID, people just aren't that interested anymore. And my theory is that probably too many of us fell for it and maybe actively participated in the process of demonizing our neighbors for having a party with 13 people instead of 12, that great sin against humanity. But either way, it's important to keep hammering that they're still doing this stuff. It is still being financed by your tax dollars, and lab leaks happen all the time. We should be freaking out a little bit.
Yeah, and it's so ironic that I think we've been able to have more serious discussions about the possibility of a lab leak, how to prevent future ones, because people are freaking out about these things less. It's become less of this all-consuming,
They're not consumed with fear.
Right. Fight on either side, and so we can have a bit more of a calm discussion about it. But the problem is, absent some sort of fear or outrage, that also then you run into this bureaucratic obstinacy of people who have forever been able to successfully resist real regulatory limits on funding dangerous research. And so I don't know where to go with that. It's just so difficult given just how, this is historically, just pandemics stick so much less in people's memories than you might think. I remember early in the pandemic, the San Francisco Chronicle went back to look at their coverage of the Spanish flu. And back then there was a huge argument in the city about whether masks should be legally mandated or not, and something that's totally disappeared from our memory. No one thinks about that anymore. Then we had the same fight 100 years later, and we'll probably forget that too. So
yeah. So what, this is the cover story, is that right, on the new...
No, it's not the cover story. They went with something about Agenda 25. Can you believe that? Yeah.
Well, Kamala tells me that that's the most important thing to talk about. Right. So. But this, it's already available online.
Mm-hmm. It is in the print issue. Mm-hmm.
And so you're a reporter at Reason.com. What else do you work on?
Oh, sure. Yep. So I have my main beat is urbanism, housing stuff. So I cover a lot of just government restrictions on your ability to, use your property, build, whatever. I have a weekly newsletter called Rent Free, which you can sign up for free. What I tell everyone is you don't have to read it. You just have to click on it. And then I've covered, related to COVID, I used to cover the lockdowns when those were a active issue. And then I've done a lot of coverage too of COVID vaccine injuries and people's efforts to get compensation, which is basically impossible under the current regulatory system. But those are kind of my main beats, and yeah, you can find all my work at Reason.com.
So will showering the housing market with $25,000 checks make housing available to everybody?
It'll be great for if you already own a home. The $25,000 subsidy to home buyers, which Kamala Harris has supported, is really a subsidy for home sellers, right? Because if you're not allowed to build new things, then the price just goes up when you put more money into it. But
so I'm now like this series I'm doing to cover up. I'll have to read your work on vaccine damage because I've felt too ignorant to really opine on any of that stuff, but it seems anecdotally that there absolutely is, as there is with every vaccine. As you start to learn about these things, every vaccine has a downside, and we weren't allowed to talk about it in this sense. But what's the bottom line on your reporting on that subject?
So the bottom line, which I didn't get into any sort of, how likely, vaccine injuries were or whatnot. What I focused on was the disparate treatment between someone who's had a COVID vaccine injury and someone who's had an injury from a normal vaccine or non-COVID vaccine. And for people who've had an injury from a non-COVID vaccine, there's a very expedited process whereby you sue the government in federal claims court. The government would pay your lawyer. There's what's called table injury. So basically, if you got this injury after having a vaccine, it's presumed that it came from the vaccine, and there's set compensation rates. And all things considered, it works pretty well. The system pays out about $200 million in compensation a year to people who have a normal vaccine injury.
Is this a government fund or a government mandated fund?
It's funded by an excise tax on the individual doses of vaccines sold.
Okay.
But the COVID compensation fund looks nothing like this. It's not a court process. You're not allowed to sue the pharmaceutical companies. You're not allowed to sue the government. You're not allowed to sue anyone. Instead, you have to go through an administrative process where you go to HHS or an administration within HHS and say, I had a COVID vaccine injury. Please compensate me. And the same department that approved the vaccine will say, no, you didn't. Goodbye. They don't have to give you any explanation for why they're turning you down. There's no set timeline for when they, will process your claim. I haven't looked at the latest numbers, but when I last wrote about this a few months ago, I think they'd approved something like 10 claims for COVID vaccine injuries and distributed a de minimis amount of compensation, like $10,000 or something like that. And then yet there's 10,000 claims from people saying that they've been injured by the vaccine, and those are people who've knew about this tiny program and managed to file a claim in the first place, right? So it's a totally different system. It's an administrative system, so you have no legal rights really. And it's basically the same government department that decided, that approved the vaccine is deciding whether to compensate you for it. So there's been proposals to try and basically shift the COVID program into the normal vaccine program, which they actually should do. Basically, the normal vaccine compensation program, which works relatively well, by all accounts, that's for any vaccine that's been approved for routine administration in children, in which the COVID vaccine has now. So by all rights, it should be under this new program, but Congress hasn't moved, or the administration hasn't moved to do that yet. So
I feel like this is a ticking time bomb in large part because of the government's central involvement in mandating it on not just healthcare workers and not just military, but at one point anybody that had a job at a large firm. So,
right.
It'll be interesting to see how the government covers this one up.
Yeah, I guess we'll see. So.
Not that they would do that. well, thank you. This has been a lot of fun. And where do we find you on social media?
Yep, sure. I'm on Twitter. Just Christian Brits is my handle. So you can I tweet there. You can get all my work and all my insane opinions. So
cool. I love insane opinions.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Thanks for watching. If you liked the conversation, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and also ring the bell for notifications. And if you want to know more about Free the People, go to freethepeople.org.